Again. The next morning, Andy approached the school slowly. He wanted to make sure Gary and his friends weren't waiting for him. They'd probably want revenge after Gary ended up in the mud. So if the three bullies were waiting, Andy would have to make sure Emmett was waiting too. Andy stopped on the edge of the middle school grounds. He stood behind the big oak tree at the corner and peeked around. There they are, he muttered to himself. Gary and his two bully friends were leaning on the railing at the front steps. They were obviously waiting for Andy. He knew they'd want to teach him a lesson. Andy scanned the schoolyard. He didn't see Emmett anywhere. If the big new kid didn't show up soon, well, Andy didn't even want to think about what the bullies would do today. He leaned his back against the big tree. Maybe if he waited long enough, the bullies would give up and go inside. He strained to listen for the first bell. He heard other students laughing and shouting. He saw a few kids running late jog past him as they headed toward the school. Suddenly, a strong hand fell onto his shoulder. Andy spun around. "Emmett!" he said. The big new kid looked down at him and nodded. "I'm glad to see you," Andy said. "Gary and his goons are waiting for me. They must be pretty mad about yesterday." Emmett looked toward the front of the school. "I see," he said. "Let's go." He didn't wait for a reply. He just started walking toward the front of the school. Andy stayed a few paces behind the taller boy, but he couldn't have kept up even if he'd wanted to. Emmett's long legs were like tree trunks, stomping quickly and heavily across the school's front lawn. As Emmett approached, Gary and his friends stood up straighter. Gary moved to block the steps. His friends followed and stood on each side of him. "Well, well," Gary said. He smirked. "If it isn't Andy and his personal oaf, you're pretty confident, aren't you?" Andy said, still a few feet behind Emmett. "I mean, after what happened yesterday, what makes you think you can talk to us like that?" Gary frowned and said, "He snuck up behind me. Now he'll pay. And so will you, Andy, so don't go anywhere." Emmett took a heavy step toward Gary. Gary's bully friends flinched, but no one ran off. Emmett took another step. "Get him!" Gary shouted. He and his friends charged at Emmett. They wrapped their arms around him to tackle him. Emmett didn't budge. Gary moved around and leaped onto Emmett's back. His goons pounded on Emmett's stomach and chest. Emmett didn't flinch. Finally, the new kid had had enough. With a great bellow, he threw out his arms, sending Gary and his friends flying and tumbling into the thick mud. The three bullies slowly got to their feet. Gary shook his head to clear it. "This isn't over," he said. "We'll get you back for this." The three bullies ran off. The first bell rang. "Oh no," Andy said. "I'm going to be late for homeroom again." Emmett didn't move. He just stood there, watching the three bullies as they ran. "Thanks," Andy said. He hurried up the steps and opened the school's front door. Emmett didn't follow. Aren't you going to homeroom? Andy asked. Emmett squinted at Andy. Not right now, Emmett said. I will go later. Andy laughed. Emmett didn't. Okay, well, I'll see you, Andy said. He headed to class. Chapter 5.